Hi, I'm creating another video today. I've been trying to put up a few lately because my content's really kind of low and I don't have a whole lot on there on my channel, but I'm trying to put in more. I'm trying to find my way around, see how things are, find out what people like. But I want it to be predominantly about Seattle because that's what I love a lot, is Seattle. But I also want to do videos on other things because I go by all things considered. Although my page is called The Pauper's Budget, and I do that for a reason, because pauper means poor, and I know how to work a budget. But all things considered, because I consider all things. Because I want to be able to talk about all subjects and still have it important, or have it pertinent to my channel. Saying that, I had somebody the other day ask me this question: how did I bump into Seattle? Because they said, did you move to Seattle for a job? I said, no, I did not. Did you move to Seattle because it's rich there? And I said, no, heavens no. When I moved to Seattle, it wasn't rich yet. Microsoft had just got started. So I thought I would tell my story on how I managed to make it to the Emerald City. Back in the late 80s, I was with a lady friend of mine named Ruby, and we had a son together. Being an artist and a photographer, I was doing a bunch of artwork and photography that Ruby didn't care for. And the reason she didn't care for it was, one, she felt kind of jealous, and two, she felt like I might cheat on her. And eventually she didn't want my son being raised around that type, because of the type of artwork I do. And at that time I was working for some magazines. I had submitted some artwork and they had bought my artwork and they liked it and used it. So I find women that I use for my work. I'm a pinup artist and portrait artist. Now I'm getting more into landscapes, but at that time I was a pinup artist, and I did drawings that were used in several different magazines, and she didn't like that. So about 1989, when my son was 3, let's see, 87, 88, 89, 90, about 1990, I'll say, between 89 and 90, she had fallen in love with a gentleman from her job. He was a doctor, and she was an RN, so she wanted to be with him because she thought that he made a respectable wage and could be at the house more than me as a father. So she told me that she didn't want me seeing my son anymore, which was heart-wrenching, and it pretty much ripped my heart out of my chest, and my whole center was gone. So I started hitchhiking. And as I make it from Iowa down into Kansas City, and I'm heading back toward Los Angeles, I get stranded in a city named Topeka, Kansas. And upon being in Topeka, Kansas, I bumped into a young girl, and she had just turned 18. Her name was Susan. I'm not going to name last names, but her name was Susan. And she had just turned 18, but she was really pretty. Not like Miss America pretty or Miss Universe pretty, but she had the qualities that I look for my work. So we started dating, and she gets homesick. Her parents live in Everett, Washington, so I rake the money together. I get us a Greyhound ticket, and I take her back to Everett, Washington. We start living together in Everett, Washington, and her parents did not approve. She was 18 and I had just turned 24, so her parents didn't approve. And it didn't work out between us. We split up, and then she came back to me a few months later, and then she started to sleep with this guy that had a car. And I was in a house and she was in a car, and she wanted me to wait to find out if it was going to work out between her and that guy, and I said I can't do it. I cannot and will not put up with that. It's either me or him. So she decided to stay with him. And I packed up my grip, some clothes and my artwork and my camera, and I decided to take off. At that time they didn't have digital cameras. I wish they did. Digital cameras are a godsend, and I hated digital cameras at first. The quality wasn't that great. I really thought it was terrible. I didn't know how to use them. Then I bumped into the Nikon digital camera. For me, that's about as simple as Windows 7 is for the computer. So anyway, I leave Everett, Washington, and as I'm taking the Greyhound to go to Los Angeles, we have a stopover in Seattle. And for some odd reason, it was about a 5-hour layover. And as I'm in Seattle, at the Greyhound, I decided to go find something to eat because I didn't want to eat at the Burger King that was at the Greyhound. So I walk around and I bump into a restaurant and I start to eat, and then I see some other things in Seattle that I'd never seen before, and I started liking it. So a couple of hours went by, and before you know it, I decided to cash my Greyhound ticket in for the remainder, and I started staying at the Commodore Hotel for a few days while I'm looking for an apartment. The more I looked around Seattle, the more I liked what I saw, the more I was in love with it. I went to the Pike Place Market, which was just right down the street from the Commodore Hotel. At that time, you could get a room at the Commodore for about $125 a week. You could get a room for about $29 a night. It was kind of a flop house, but they still tried to keep it up. It didn't look like your typical flop house. It was one of those really cozy, old-time hotels. And I ended up getting an apartment up in Capitol Hill. I got a job working at the Pike Place Market, and everything was great. And then go to the Space Needle to have lunch. I'd go into Pioneer Square for like the Tony Roma's to have dinner. Sometimes I'd go. There was restaurants on the pier, you know, the wharf. I'd go there, and you know, I would just do various things. And I just really, really loved it. And the more I saw of Seattle, the more I liked it. Living in Capitol Hill, I could walk down Broadway to Pike, go down Pike Street, all the way to downtown. As you're walking, it was a beautiful walk. You could look off to the right and see the Space Needle and part of the Puget Sound, and you could look down and you could see downtown and the Puget Sound. It was just a gorgeous thing. In the mornings when I woke up, the air coming through the window was just incredible. I'd smell the salt air. Then I would smell fresh baked bread because I lived not too far from a bakery. And, you know, it was just a gorgeous time for me. That was back in the early 90s, about 1990, 91, and I stayed till about the mid-90s. Some things happened and I had to move. Some family stuff. And I decided to move. And now I want to move back to Seattle, but I'm afraid that it's not the same Seattle that I fell in love with. I'm afraid that the transplants have moved in and destroyed everything. So, what are you going to do? I live in Minneapolis now. My heart's still in Seattle. I do artwork that caters to Seattle, skyscapes, landscapes and things. And I do my Seattle blog from here. I'm going back in June for a visit on my birthday, the 17th. I'll be flying 17th. Have dinner at the Space Needle on the 18th. I'll stay the 19th, and I'll come home on the 20th. I'm going to stay at an Airbnb for a few days because the hotels are way too expensive. And an Airbnb will cost me $20 a night, and it's 10 minutes away from downtown, which is good because I can walk. And when I lived there before, I walked everywhere. From my apartment to downtown, I walked. If I wanted to go to Space Needle, though, I'd get on the monorail at the Westlake Shopping Center, and I'd jet over to the Space Needle. And then on a good day, sometimes I would walk back from the Space Needle. I walked all the way up into Queen Anne from the Space Needle. I used to walk a lot, and I was very healthy when I lived there. Since moving to Minneapolis, I went from about 170 pounds. I went up to about 3-something, and right now I'm 52 years old. I'll be 53 in June. So if I was to be able to move back to Seattle, would I like it? Would I hate it? I'm afraid to even go on a visit because I'm afraid that the transplants and all of the people seeking wealth have destroyed what I consider to be beautiful about Seattle. And when I was there, we had underground bus tunnels, which took the stress off the city, the streets of the city during rush hour. The buses were totally free in downtown, and they were all electric because we didn't want smog. We loved our clean air, and we wanted it to stay that way. They didn't have the light rails at that time. We did have the ferry boats, and going over to Marrowstone Island on a Saturday to do some shopping and have dinner was great. It was just a really beautiful time, and I really enjoyed it, and my artwork flourished. I found loads and loads of women in Seattle that I could use for my models, and now that I'm in Minneapolis, it's dropped off quite heavily. The rent that I pay here for this studio apartment that I have, which as soon as I get it redesigned, I'm going to show you a walkthrough. But when I get a chance, but I pay $445 a month. It's a 284 square foot apartment. It has a kitchen and a bath. It's too small for me. I need a much bigger kitchen because I love to cook. And I'm also going to be doing a segment called The World's Smallest Kitchen, brought to you by the Pauper's Budget. Anyway, that's just a little backstory on how I found Seattle and why I fell in love with Seattle. It wasn't for a job. It wasn't to be bougie. It was just a way for me to enjoy a city that I fell in love with. Anyway, this has been All Things Considered, because I consider all things. Good day, Seattle, and all points beyond.